"You can't leave me here." She said it quietly, not shouting, not begging, just a woman standing in the mud with a suitcase in one hand and a rope tied to a skinny cow in the other, watching the back of a carriage disappear down the hill into the March fog. Nobody turned around. Nobody called her name. Colette Morrow Calloway, 28 years old, a widow of 40 days, stood alone in front of a stone house that hadn't been lived in for 21 years. The roof sagged in the middle. Half the windows were boarded shut. The front door hung open like a mouth that had forgotten how to close. They gave her this. They took the farm. They took the money. They took everything her dead husband had touched. And they gave her a ruin on a hill and a cow that looked like it might not survive the week. They thought she would break. They thought she would come crawling back down that hill within a month, begging for a room, a meal, a place at someone else's table. But what the Calloway family didn't know, what nobody in the town of Cardon knew, was that behind the crumbling mantelpiece of that stone house hidden inside the wall for 21 years, there was a document that could destroy them all, and Colette was going to find it. "You can't leave me here." She said it quietly, not shouting, not begging, just a woman standing in the mud with a suitcase in one hand and a rope tied to a skinny cow in the other, watching the back of a carriage disappear down the hill into the March fog. Nobody turned around. Nobody called her name. Colette Morrow Calloway, 28 years old, a widow of 40 days, stood alone in front of a stone house that hadn't been lived in for 21 years. The roof sagged in the middle. Half the windows were boarded shut. The front door hung open like a mouth that had forgotten how to close. They gave her this. They took the farm. They took the money. They took everything her dead husband had touched, and they gave her a ruin on a hill and a cow that looked like it might not survive the week. They thought she would break. They thought she would come crawling back down that hill within a month, begging for a room, a meal, a place at someone else's table. But what the Calloway family didn't know, what nobody in the town of Cardon knew, was that behind the crumbling mantelpiece of that stone house hidden inside the wall for 21 years, there was a document that could destroy them all. And Colette was going to find it. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back. Back to the beginning, back to the fever, back to the 5 days that changed everything. Harlon Calloway was not a complicated man. He was 31 years old, average height, with hands that were always slightly rough from working the land, and a voice that never rose above a conversational tone, even when he was angry. He owned a small farm on the west side of the town of Cardon, Missouri, 40 acres of decent soil, a barn that needed a new roof, and a half share in the old Calloway family property up on the hill. The property on the hill was the stone house. Nobody called it a house anymore. They called it the ruin. They called it that place up on Cardon Hill. Some of the older folks in town remembered when the Calloways had lived up there, back when the family still had pretensions of grandeur. But that was a long time ago, before the debts, before the slow slide from respectability into something less defined. Harlon married Colette Morrow when he was 27, and she was 24. It was not a marriage of passion. It was a marriage of practicality, the kind that happened in small Missouri towns in 1878, when a man needed a wife and a woman needed a roof. Colette was the daughter of a school teacher from Boone County, who had died young, leaving behind a widow. and a daughter who could read in 2 languages and fold linen in 3 different ways. Her mother had raised her to be useful, to be sharp, and to never depend on anyone she didn't trust. Colette did not love Harlon wildly, but she respected him. He was decent. He didn't drink to excess. He didn't raise his hand. He worked his land with the quiet persistence of a man who knew he would never be rich but hoped to be comfortable. And for 4 years, their life together was exactly that comfortable. Not exciting, not miserable. Just a life lived day by day, season by season in a small town where nothing much happened and nobody much cared. Then the fever came. It started on a Tuesday in March. Harlon came in from the fields with a headache and a chill that wouldn't stop. By Wednesday, he couldn't get out of bed. By Thursday, the sweat had soaked through the mattress, and his skin had turned the color of old wax. Colette sent for the doctor. The doctor was Silas Whitford, 53 years old, gray hair cut short, steady hands, a face that had seen enough suffering to know when it was serious and when it wasn't. He rode out to the Callaway farm on Thursday evening, examined Harlon, and told Colette what she already knew in the pit of her stomach. "It's bad," he said. "The fever is deep. I can try to bring it down, but I want you to prepare yourself." "Prepare myself for what?" Colette asked, even though she knew. Whitford looked at her for a long moment. He had been a doctor in Carleton County for 22 years. He had delivered babies and closed the eyes of the dead. He had learned a long time ago that the kindest thing you could do for a person was to tell them the truth before they had to discover it on their own. For the possibility that he doesn't come through this. Colette nodded. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She went back into the bedroom and sat down next to Harlon and took his hand. She held that hand for 5 days. 5 days of wet cloths on his forehead. 5 days of broth that he couldn't swallow. 5 days of listening to his breathing get thinner and thinner, like a rope being pulled through a hole that kept getting smaller. She didn't sleep. She barely ate. She talked to him sometimes not because she thought he could hear her, but because the silence was worse than anything she could say. On Monday morning, just before dawn, Harlon Callaway stopped breathing. Colette sat with the body for an hour. She didn't move. She didn't call anyone. She just sat there in the gray light of early morning, holding the hand of a man who was no longer there, and she let the fact of it settle into her bones. Then she stood up. She washed the body herself. She sewed the burial cloth herself. She laid him out on the bed with his hands folded across his chest, and she went outside and stood in the cold March air and breathed. The world was still there. The barn was still there. The chickens were still clucking in their coop. The sky was the color of iron. And Colette Morrow Callaway was a widow at 28. The Callaways arrived 2 days later for the funeral. They came from different directions, but they all arrived with the same expression, a careful arrangement of the face that was supposed to look like grief, but looked more like calculation. Colette watched them come up the road from the kitchen window, and she felt something cold settle in her chest. Something she couldn't name yet, but would come to understand very well in the days that followed. Leland Callaway was the first to arrive. He was Harlon's older brother by 3 years. A tall man with a narrow face and eyes that moved quickly. always assessing, always measuring. He wore a black coat that fit him well, and boots that had been polished recently. He shook Colette's hand at the door and said the right things in the right order, so sorry, such a loss. If there's anything I can do, and all the while his eyes were moving past her, through her into the house, cataloging things. Colette didn't know it yet. But Leland Calloway was drowning, not in grief, in debt. He had borrowed heavily against his own property to invest in a railroad speculate that had gone wrong, and he was 3 months behind on payments to a bank in St. Louis that did not have a reputation for patience. Leland needed money. He needed assets. And Harlon's death, as terrible as it was, had opened a door. Prosper Calloway arrived next Harlon's uncle from St. Louis. He was a large man in his 60s with soft hands and well-groomed sideburns, and a way of entering a room that made it feel smaller. He had made money in dry goods and never let anyone forget it. He clasped Colette's hands in both of his and told her that Harlon had been like a son to him, which was a lie, and that she should not worry about anything, which was a bigger lie. The last to arrive was Haskell Braddock. Braddock was the town's notary, a word that in Cardin County meant something closer to judge, banker, and priest rolled into one. He was 60 years old, thin as a fence post, with half-moon spectacles, and a voice that sounded like he was reading aloud from a document he had written himself. His father had been the town notary before him. The Braddock family had been handling the legal affairs of Cardin County for 2 generations, and in that time they had accumulated something more valuable than money. They had accumulated secrets. The funeral was held at the church on Wednesday morning. The Reverend Aldrich spoke about the faithfulness of the departed and the mercy of the Lord and the comfort that awaited those who believed. Colette sat in the front pew in black, her hands folded in her lap, her face still. She listened to the words and felt nothing. Not because she didn't care, but because she had already done her grieving in the 5 days beside the bed. In the hour she sat with the body in the cold March morning when she stood outside and realized that the world had gone on without asking her permission. After the funeral, after the neighbors had brought their casseroles and their condolences and gone home after the last of the mourners had filtered out of the church, Colette expected the family to sit down with her, to talk about what came next, to offer help, or at least the pretense of help. Instead, Haskell Braddock convened a reading of the will. He did it the very next morning in his office on Main Street, a room that smelled of candle wax and old dust and something else, authority maybe, or the memory of it. The office had dark wood paneling and a desk that was too large for the room and a clock on the wall that ticked with mechanical precision, as if reminding everyone that time belonged to the man who owned the clock. Colette was seated at the back. Leland sat near the front, one leg crossed over the other, his face neutral. Prosper sat beside him, filling his chair completely. Braddock stood behind his desk and put on his spectacles and opened a folder. "The will of Harlon James Calloway," he began, dated February the 12th, 1882. February, 1 month before Harlon died. Colette felt something flicker at the edge of her attention, a small thing like a match struck in a dark room. February. Had Harlon known he was going to die? Had he been sick before the fever? Or had someone asked him to sign a will? She kept her face still and listened. The will was short. Braddock read it in his flat, careful voice, and as he read, Colette felt the room change around her, felt the air thicken, felt the walls lean in. The farm, the 40 acres, the barn, the house where she and Harlon had lived for 4 years went to Leland. The savings, what little there was, went to Prosper, to repay debts that Harlon had apparently owed. And the stone house on Carden Hill, the ruin that no one had lived in for 21 years, went to Colette. There was a silence, then a few glances exchanged between Leland and Prosper. Then a smile, a small one, barely there. A tightening at the corner of Leland's mouth that lasted less than a second, but that Colette saw as clearly as if he had laughed out loud. She understood that smile. She understood it completely. The stone house was worthless. It was a ruin. The roof leaked. The walls were crumbling. The floors were rotted in places. Nobody had wanted it for 2 decades. It was not a gift. It was a disposal. A clean, legal, unassailable way to push her out the door without having to lay a hand on her. They had given her nothing and called it something. And here was the second thing, the thing that flickered at the edge of her attention and now caught fire. She looked at the will. At the bottom of the page beneath the typed text, there was Harlan's signature. She knew that signature. She had seen it 100 times on letters, on receipts, on the deed to the farm. She knew the way his H leaned slightly to the left, the way his L looped wide, the way the final Y trailed off like a breath. The signature on the will was close, very close. But the H didn't lean, and the L was too tight. And there was a tremor in the middle of the name at the place where Harlan's hand had always been steadiest. It was wrong. Colette said nothing. She folded her hands. She lowered her eyes. And she kept the knowledge inside her like a stone in her pocket, heavy and smooth and hers. The town of Carden, Missouri was not large. A few hundred souls, maybe less. A church with a steeple that leaned slightly to the west since the storm of '69. A main street paved with gray brick and lined with storefronts that had seen better decades. A general store, a feed store, a blacksmith, a barber shop where men sat on Saturday mornings and talked about weather and politics and the private failures of their neighbors. And all around the town, stretching in every direction, until the land met the sky fields of winter wheat and sorghum that were just beginning to turn green under the weak March sun. It was one of those places in the middle of America that seemed to have forgotten that the world was changing. People lived here the way they had always lived, by the seasons, by the debts, by the judgments of the people who sat in the front pews on Sunday morning. In 1882, the railroads were pushing west, and the cities were growing, and the country was becoming something new and loud and modern. But in Carden, Missouri, the old hierarchies still held. The notaries, the landowners, the men who controlled the money and the paper, those men decided everything. Who could inherit? Who could stay? Who had to leave? The news of the will spread through the town, the way all news spreads in small towns by word of mouth, with additions and subtractions depending on who was doing the talking. At the general store, Mrs. Pritchard told Mrs. Ganley that she had heard the Calloway widow got nothing but a pile of rocks on a hill. And Mrs. Ganley said that was a shame, but what could you expect a woman alone with no family of her own and no children to speak for her? At the barber shop, old Willard Tench said that Leland Calloway had always been a sharp one, and that the widow should have seen it coming. Nobody said that what had happened was wrong. Nobody said it was unjust. They said it was the way things were. 2 days after the reading of the will, 2 men came to the farm. They were Leland's men, hired hands from a property south of town, and they came with a wagon and instructions to help Colette move her things. Not Harlon's things, hers. They were polite about it in the way that men are polite when they're following orders they don't particularly care about. They carried her suitcase out to the wagon. They brought out her winter coat and her sewing box and the black shawl she had worn to the funeral. They did not bring the rocking chair that had been her mother's. They did not bring the quilt she had made the first winter of her marriage. When she asked about these things, the taller of the 2 men looked at the ground and said that those items had been listed as property of the household and were staying with the farm, property of the household. As if 4 years of her life could be cataloged and divided like goods at an auction. They gave her one more thing. A cow. A thin, brown cow with tired eyes that had been tied up in the yard for 3 weeks because nobody had bothered to sell it and nobody wanted to feed it. The cow was not a kindness. The cow was an afterthought, a leftover, a problem they were handing to someone else. And they gave her a key, a large iron key, rusted and heavy, that opened the gate to the stone house on Cardin Hill. The wagon took her to the bottom of the hill road and stopped. The driver, a young man with a face that wouldn't meet her eyes, said the road was too rough for the wheels, that the ruts would break the axle. Colette looked at the road. It was rough, yes, but not impassable. She had seen worse roads in Boone County. The driver was lying, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so. She took her suitcase. She took the rope tied to the cow, and she began to climb. The hill was steeper than it looked from below. The road, if you could call it a road, was a narrow track of packed earth and loose stone that wound upward through a thicket of wild growth. Blackberry bushes had overtaken the edges, and their thorns caught at her skirt as she climbed. The cow pulled against the rope with the slow stubbornness of an animal that has no reason to go anywhere. Colette pulled back. She was stronger than she looked, and she was angrier than she would admit. And between the two, the cow lost the argument. Halfway up, she stopped. She set the suitcase down and stood there, breathing hard, and looked back down the hill. She could see the rooftops of Cardin below the gray brick of Main Street, the steeple of the church leaning west, the dark squares of farmland stretching out toward the river. From up here, the town looked small. It looked like something you could hold in your hand and close your fist around. She wondered how many people down there were watching. She wondered how many of them expected her to turn around. She picked up the suitcase. She tightened her grip on the rope, and she kept climbing. It took her 20 minutes to reach the top. The stone house sat at the crest of Cardin Hill like something that had been forgotten by time. It was built in a style that had been fashionable 50 years ago. Heavy stone walls, a pitched slate roof, a tower on the east side that had partially collapsed, and a wide front facade with 6 tall windows, 3 of which had lost their glass and been boarded over with planks that were now gray and splitting. There had been a garden once. You could see the ghost of it, the lines of old flower beds, the remains of a stone path, the skeleton of a trellis against the south wall. But the garden had been swallowed by 21 years of neglect. Wild grass grew waist-high in the yard. Young trees had sprouted through the flagstones of the courtyard. A well stood in the center of it all, its stone rim covered in moss, its bucket long gone. Colette put the key in the gate. The lock resisted. She turned harder. The iron bit into her palm. The gate groaned and then gave way with a sound that carried across the hilltop like a cry, a long, rusted scream of metal against metal that startled a pair of crows out of the oak tree by the collapsed tower. They rose into the gray sky, circled once, and settled again. Even the birds, it seemed, had nowhere else to go. The courtyard was a wreck. Weeds grew between the flagstones. A rusted water trough lay on its side near the well. An old wagon wheel leaned against the east wall. Its spokes rotted to nothing. But the walls of the house, the main walls, the ones that carried the weight of the structure, were standing. They were thick, solid, built by someone who understood that the things you build to last must be built from stone, not wood, not hope, not the good intentions of men who will be dead in 20 years. Colette looked at those walls. She looked at them the way a sailor looks at a shore after a storm. Not with relief, not yet, but with the recognition that something solid existed, and that if she could reach it, she might survive. She stepped through. And here was the strange thing. The thing she noticed about herself before she noticed anything about the house. She was not afraid. She should have been. A woman alone standing in front of a ruin with no money, no family, no help, and a cow that looked like it was considering lying down and dying. She should have been terrified. But what she felt was not fear. What she felt was something colder and sharper and more useful. It was a decision. A decision that had been forming in her body for days, maybe weeks, maybe since the moment she saw the smile on Leland's face in the notary's office. She was going to survive here. She was going to make this place hers. And she was going to do it alone because alone was all she had, and she was done pretending that was a weakness. The front door was not locked. The lock had been broken for years. Inside, the air smelled of damp stone, rotted wood, and something else, something sweeter and older that she couldn't identify. It was the smell of time, the smell of a place that had been holding its breath for 2 decades, waiting for someone to walk through the door and tell it that it still mattered. She moved through the front hall. The floorboards creaked under every step, and she tested each one with the ball of her foot before committing her weight the way her mother had taught her to walk on old floors. Find the joists, step where the nails are, avoid the dark spots. At the back of the hall, she found a room that must have been a parlor or a dining room. It was large with high ceilings and walls that had once been plastered white, but were now stained with water damage in patterns that looked like maps of countries that didn't exist. There was furniture, a heavy table, solid oak too heavy for anyone to have bothered stealing. 2 chairs, a tall cabinet with a door that wouldn't close, and a fireplace. The fireplace was the best thing in the room. It was built of cut stone with a wide mantelpiece that had been carved with a pattern of leaves and vines that the years had darkened but not destroyed. It was the kind of fireplace that a man with money and taste had commissioned, and it had been built to last. Colette stood in front of it and put her hand on the stone. It was cold, but it was solid. Everything else in this house might be falling apart, but the fireplace was still standing. She set her suitcase down. She went outside and found what was left of the stable a lean-to structure behind the main house, with half a roof and a dirt floor. She led the cow inside and tied her to a post. The cow looked at her with an expression that was either resignation or gratitude. It was hard to tell with cows. Then Colette went back into the main room and sat down on one of the two chairs. She sat there for a long time. She didn't move. She didn't cry. She looked at the empty fireplace and the empty room and the boarded windows and the cracked ceiling, and she let the silence settle around her like water filling a basin. Then she stood up. She went outside into the wild garden and gathered dead branches until her arms were full. She carried them inside. She arranged them in the fireplace, small ones first, then larger ones on top, the way her mother had shown her when she was 12, and they had lived through a winter with no money for coal. She found matches in her sewing box. She struck one. The flame caught. The fire changed everything. Not the house, not her situation, not the facts of what had been done to her, but the room. The room changed. The shadows pulled back. The stone walls caught the orange light and held it. The carved leaves on the mantelpiece seemed to move just slightly, as if the heat were bringing them back to life. And the smell changed too, from damp stone and rot to wood smoke, and warmth, the smell of a place where someone was living. Colette sat on the floor in front of the fire and watched the flames. She thought about her mother. Catherine Morrow had been a woman who believed that competence was a form of dignity, that if you could feed yourself and keep yourself warm and mend what was broken, then no one could truly defeat you. She had raised Colette on that belief the way other mothers raised their daughters on prayer or propriety. Learn to do things her mother had said. Learn to do them well. And when the world takes everything else from you, it cannot take what your hands know how to do. Catherine Morrow had died 3 years before Colette married Harlon. Consumption. It had taken her slowly, the way a river takes a bank, not all at once, but steadily, persistently, until one day there was nothing left to stand on. Colette had nursed her through the final months, just as she would later nurse Harlon through his final days. She had learned something from that first death, that she carried into the second, that the worst part of watching someone die was not the grief. It was the helplessness, the knowledge that your hands, no matter how skilled, no matter how willing, could not hold back the thing that was coming. But here on this hill in this broken house, there was no helplessness. There was work to be done and she could do it. The roof leaked and she could patch it. The walls were crumbling and she could shore them up. The garden was wild and she could clear it. Every problem in this house was a problem with a solution, and solutions were something Colette Morrow understood. That evening, for the first time since Harlon died, Colette ate something warm. She heated water in a pot she found in the kitchen and made a thin soup from dried beans she had brought in her suitcase. She ate it sitting at the oak table by the light of the fire, with the cow breathing softly in the stable outside, and the March wind pressing against the boarded windows. It was not much. It was almost nothing. But it was hers. The next morning, Colette woke before dawn. She had slept on the floor of the parlor on a bed of straw she had gathered from the stable wrapped in her winter coat. Her back ached. Her hands were cold. But she was awake and she was alive, and she had work to do. She walked through the house with a different eye, not the eye of someone who had been defeated, the eye of someone who was taking inventory. She counted the rooms. There were 14 if you included the ones that were barely rooms anymore, the ones where the ceiling had caved in or the floor had rotted through. Of the 14, 6 were usable. The parlor, a smaller room next to it that might have been a study. The kitchen, which was large and had a cast-iron stove that, after some cleaning and coaxing, still worked. 2 rooms on the second floor that were dry and had intact floors. And the cellar. She tested every floorboard. She examined every wall. She found the cracks that were dangerous, the ones where the stone was shifting, where the weight of the structure was pulling in the wrong direction. And she found the ones that were only ugly, only time, only neglect. The cast-iron stove in the kitchen was her second great discovery. It was heavy black, built to last a century, and someone had left it behind because it was too heavy to move. Colette cleaned it with rags torn from an old curtain. She found the flue and opened it. She built a fire inside it and felt the heat radiate through the kitchen like a living thing. The stove worked. The stove was gonna keep her alive. She went down to the cellar. The cellar was dark and cool and smelled of earth and old wine. There were shelves along one wall, mostly empty, but with a few things left behind. Glass jars with no lids. Rusted tools, a coil of wire, and several crates of old bottles. Some broken, some intact. Against the far wall there was a pile of wooden planks stacked against the stone, as if someone had started a repair project and abandoned it. And behind the planks in the corner, there was a trunk. It was made of brown leather, cracked and stiff with age, fastened with 2 buckled straps. It was heavy. Colette dragged it out from behind the planks and across the cellar floor, and then because she couldn't carry it up the stairs, she opened it right there in the dim light. Inside she found clothes. Women's clothes folded carefully, made of fine linen that had yellowed with time. A prayer book with a name written inside the front cover in brown ink. Marguerite Calloway, 1841. A silver locket oval-shaped with a small portrait inside, a man in a military uniform, young, serious looking at the artist with the expression of someone who believed he would live forever. And at the bottom of the trunk, wrapped in a square of green velvet that had faded to the color of moss, there was a notebook. It was small, no larger than a man's hand, with a cover of soft leather that had been supple once and was now stiff and dry. Colette picked it up. She held it carefully, the way you hold something that might be fragile or might be important, or might be both. She opened it. The first page bore a date, September 1853. And below the date, in a hand that was fine and even and careful, a single line. I begin this journal because if I do not write it down, no one will ever know the truth. Colette closed the notebook. She held it in her hands for a long moment, looking at it the way you look at a door that you know leads somewhere, but you're not sure you're ready to go. Then she carried it upstairs and set it on the oak table next to the bowl of milk she had drawn from the cow that morning. There was a time for everything, and she would learn soon enough that this notebook contained things that certain powerful men in the town of Cardon had spent a great deal of effort making sure no one would ever find. But for now there was work. Colette spent the rest of that day doing what needed to be done, not what she wanted to do. She wanted to sit down and read every page of that notebook until she understood what Marguerite Calloway had been trying to say. But the cow needed water. The stable needed cleaning. The kitchen stove needed a fire. And the windows, the ones that still had glass, needed washing because the light that came through them was so dim and gray that the rooms felt like the inside of a closed hand. She worked until the sun went down. She hauled water from the well in a bucket she found in the cellar, testing each pull of the rope, each taste of the water. It was good. Cold and clean with a mineral edge that told her the well was deep and the source was true. She cleared the worst of the debris from the courtyard. Fallen stones, dead branches, the skeleton of a wooden crate that had rotted into something soft and useless. She swept the kitchen floor with a broom she made from birch twigs, tied with a strip of cloth from her suitcase. And while she worked, she thought about Harlon, not with anger, not yet. Anger would come later, and it would come for different reasons. For now, she thought about him with a kind of bewildered tenderness, the way you think about someone who was standing right next to you for years and somehow never told you the one thing that mattered. She thought about the nights they had sat at the kitchen table in the farmhouse, the lamp between them, Harlon reading the Cardin County Gazette and Colette mending a shirt or writing a letter to a cousin in Boone County. She thought about the way he had looked at her sometimes. A quick glance, almost furtive, as if he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words or the courage. Had he known? Had he known about Marguerite? About the house? About what had been done? She didn't know. But the notebook was on the table, and the answer was inside it, and she would get to it when she was ready. On the third morning, the baker came. His name was Clyde Sumner, a stout man in his 40s with flour permanently embedded in the creases of his knuckles. He drove a small cart up the hill road, the same road that the wagon driver had claimed was too rough for wheels. And he arrived at the gate with 2 loaves of bread and a look on his face that was half curiosity and half something else. Respect, maybe. Or astonishment. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, tipping his hat. "Heard you were up here. Brought you some bread." Colette looked at the bread. She looked at the baker. She had not expected kindness, and for a moment she didn't know what to do with it. "What do I owe you?" she asked. "Nothing today. But if that cow of yours starts giving milk, I wouldn't say no to a pint now and then." It was a small thing. 2 loaves of bread and a practical arrangement. But it was the first transaction of Colette's new life, and it told her something important. She was not invisible. She was not erased. She was a woman on a hill with a cow and a house and something to trade. And as long as she had something to trade, she was part of the world. The baker came back the next day, and the day after that. Within a week, it was a routine. He brought bread, she gave him milk. He told her the news from town, who was sick, who was buying, who was selling, who. It said what about whom. And through these small reports delivered casually over the stone wall of the courtyard, Colette began to understand the shape of the community she was living above. She learned that Leland Calloway had moved into the farmhouse already and had changed the furniture. She learned that Braddock had been seen at the county courthouse twice in 1 week, which was unusual. She learned that people in town were talking about her, some with pity, some with admiration, most with the careful neutrality of people who didn't want to take sides until they knew which side was gonna win. And she learned one more thing. The baker told her on the 5th morning, almost as an afterthought, while he was climbing back onto his cart. "There's a woman in town," he said. "Old woman, name of Odette Farrow. Used to work up here years ago when the Calloways still lived in this house. She's been asking about you." Asking what? Asking if you found anything. Colette stood very still. The morning air was cool on her face. The cow was grazing behind her in the patch of wild grass she had cleared. "Tell her she can come up and ask me herself," Colette said. The baker nodded, tipped his hat again, and drove his cart back down the hill. And Colette went inside and sat down at the oak table and picked up the notebook and opened it to the second page. It was time. It was Silas Whitford who came first. He rode up the hill on a Thursday morning in early April, when the apple trees at the bottom of the hill were just beginning to show their blossoms, and the air smelled of mud and new growth. He rode a bay horse that he had owned for 12 years. A calm animal that knew the roads of Cardin County better than most people did. Whitford had thought about this visit for a week before making it. He had lain in bed at night and stared at the ceiling of his house on Elm Street and argued with himself the way a man argues with himself when he knows what the right thing to do is and is trying to find a reason not to do it. He had known Harlon Calloway. Not well, but well enough. He had treated him during the fever. He had come to the farm every day for those 5 days, and he had watched Colette watch her husband die with a tenacity that had struck him, that had stayed with him the way certain images stay with you, not because they are beautiful, but because they are true. And when he had heard what the Calloway family had done, the will, the farm, the stone house, he had felt something that he recognized immediately because he had felt it before. Shame. Not his own shame exactly, but a kind of borrowed shame. A complicity of silence. He had been in Braddock's office for the reading of the will. He had heard the terms. He had seen the smile on Leland's face. And he had said nothing. He had said nothing because saying something would have meant standing up in a room full of Callaways and Braddocks and telling them that what they were doing was wrong. And Silas Whitford had spent 22 years in Cardin County learning that the men who ran things did not appreciate being told they were wrong. But there was another reason. A deeper one. A reason that went back 21 years to a woman named Marguerite Calloway, and to a silence that Whitford had carried like a stone in his chest ever since. He had been a young doctor then, 32 years old, new to Cardin County, still trying to build a practice, still trying to earn the trust of a community that did not give its trust easily. He had seen Marguerite Calloway in the last year of her life. He had seen the way the family treated her, not with cruelty exactly, but with something worse. With erasure. They looked through her. They spoke about her as if she were not in the room. They had taken her house and her name and her dignity, and they had left her with nothing but the walls she lived inside and the silence she carried. Whitford had seen it. He had understood it. And he had done nothing because he was young and afraid, and because the Callaways and the Braddocks were the kind of people you did not cross if you wanted to keep your practice and your place in the community. Marguerite had died in 1861. Heart failure, they said. And maybe it was. But Whitford had always wondered in the quiet hours, in the sleepless nights, in the moments when a man's conscience speaks louder than his comfort, whether Marguerite Calloway had died of a broken heart in the most literal sense. Whether you could kill someone by taking everything that made them who they were. He had carried that question for 21 years. And now here was Colette, another woman, another Calloway widow, another silence waiting to happen. He found the gate open when he reached the top of the hill. He found the courtyard swept. Someone had cleared the fallen branches and the loose stones. The well had been uncovered. The stable had fresh straw. He found the front door open. He knocked anyway. Colette appeared at the doorway. She wore an apron over her morning dress. Her hands were covered in gray dust. Plaster dust, he realized. She had been working on the walls. "Dr. Whitford," she said. "Mrs. Calloway, I wanted to see that you were settled. Come in." Inside, he saw that she had been busy. The parlor was clean. Not polished, not restored, but clean swept, scrubbed, organized. The stove in the kitchen was burning. He could feel its warmth from the hallway. The oak table had been wiped down. 2 chairs stood neatly. A bowl of fresh milk sat beside a loaf of bread that the baker from the village must have brought up. And next to the milk on the table, there was a small notebook with a soft leather cover. His eyes stopped on it. "You found something?" he said. Colette followed his gaze. She hesitated. A small hesitation, barely a breath. But he noticed it because he was a man who had spent his life reading the things that people didn't say. A trunk in the cellar. Belongings of a woman named Marguerite Calloway. And a notebook. "Marguerite Calloway," Whitford repeated. He said the name slowly, the way you say a name that you have been carrying in your head for a long time and have not spoken aloud in years. "You knew her," Colette said. It was not a question. Whitford did not answer immediately. He walked to one of the chairs and sat down without being invited. He placed his hands flat on his knees. For a few seconds, he looked out the window at the hillside, at the wild garden, at the sky, as if he were searching for something in the landscape that would help him say what he needed to say. "Marguerite Calloway was Harlon's mother," he said. "She died in 1861. They said it was her heart. But there were people at the time who thought differently." He paused. The clock of silence in the room ticked louder than any clock on any wall. "I was one of them." He told her what he knew. Not everything, he didn't have everything, but enough. He told her that Marguerite had been a woman of education and composure, who had married into the Calloway family from a family called DeLorme, a family of some standing that had died out in the years before the war. He told her that after Marguerite's husband had died, the family had closed ranks around the property and the money and had pushed Marguerite to the edges of her own life the way you push a piece of furniture to the wall when you no longer need it in the center of the room. He told her that he had been too young and too afraid to do anything about it, that he had watched it happen and told himself it was not his business the way men tell themselves things are not their business when the cost of making it their business is higher than their courage. And he told her one more thing, something he had never told anyone. The week before Marguerite died, he said, "She asked to see me, not as a doctor. She wanted to tell me something. She said she had written things down, important things, things that people needed to know. She asked me to help her get the writing to someone who could do something with it. A lawyer, a judge, someone outside of Cardin. Did you help her?" Whitford was quiet for a long time. "No," he said. "I told her I would think about it. I went home. I thought about it for 3 days. And on the 4th day, she was dead." The room was very still. The fire in the stove made small sounds, the creak and pop of burning wood. Outside, the cow shifted in the stable, and the sound of her hooves on the packed dirt floor was the only thing that moved. Colette looked at Whitford. She did not look at him with judgment. She did not look at him with pity. She looked at him with the clear, level gaze of a woman who had spent the last month learning that the world was built on silences, and that the only way to tear one down was to start speaking. She wrote it down, Colette said, just like she told you she would. She wrote it all down. She picked up the notebook from the table. She held it for a moment, feeling its weight, feeling the leather under her fingers, feeling the decades of silence compressed between its pages. "Then maybe you should read this with me," she said. Whitford looked at the notebook. He looked at Colette, and he felt something shift inside him. Something that had been locked in place for 21 years. Something heavy and old, and tired finally beginning to move. It was not redemption. Not yet. Redemption was too large a word for a Thursday morning in April. But it was a beginning. It was the first step on a road that he had been standing at the edge of for 2 decades, afraid to walk. He reached out and took the notebook from her hands. "Yes," he said. "I think maybe I should." Colette sat down across from him. She folded her hands on the table, and for a moment before they opened the notebook, before the words of a dead woman began to fill the room like smoke from an old fire, the two of them simply sat there in the stone house on Cardin Hill and listened to the silence. It was the last silence that house would ever hold. The light through the window was pale and cool. The fire crackled in the stove. The cow lowed softly in the stable outside. And in the stone house on Cardin Hill, 2 people sat down at an oak table and opened a dead woman's journal. And the past, which had been buried for so long, began to breathe again. The notebook of Marguerite Calloway did not give up its secrets easily. The ink had faded in places, turned from dark brown to the pale amber of weak tea. The pages were warped from years of dampness in the cellar, and some of the words had bled into one another, making them difficult to separate. The handwriting was small and even and disciplined. The handwriting of a woman who had been taught to write by someone who believed that penmanship was a measure of character. But the words were clear enough. Colette read aloud slowly, carefully, leaning close to the page in the gray morning light. Whitford sat across from her, his hands flat on the table, his face still the way a man's face goes. Still when he is hearing something he already suspected but never wanted confirmed. The first entry was dated September 1853. Marguerite had been a widow for 6 months. Her husband, Cornelius Calloway, had died in March of that year. The same month, Colette noticed with a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature that Harlon would die 29 years later. March seemed to be the month the Calloway men left their women behind. Marguerite wrote about the days after the funeral. She wrote about the visitors who came and went, the neighbors who brought food and stayed too long, the relatives who appeared from places she had never heard of, with condolences she did not believe. And she wrote about the notary. His name was Aldous Braddock, the father of Haskell Braddock, the man who had started it all. Aldous Braddock came to the house today, Marguerite had written. He brought papers. He said they were routine. He said that the estate needed to be settled, and that as a widow I would need someone to manage my affairs. I told him that I was capable of managing my own affairs. He smiled at me the way men smile at women who say things they find amusing but not serious. Colette stopped reading. She looked at Whitford. "Go on," he said quietly. She turned the page. The entries that followed told the story in pieces the way all true stories are told. Not in a single sweep, but in fragments, in moments, in the small accumulations of injustice that build up like sediment at the bottom of a river, until one day the river changes course. Marguerite had not been born a Calloway. She had been born Marguerite DeLorme, the only daughter of a family that had once been among the most respected in the county. The DeLormes had settled in Cardon in the 1820s when the land was still cheap and the future still felt infinite. They had built the stone house on the hill not as a showpiece, but as a home, a place meant to last generations. Marguerite's father, Emile DeLorme, had designed it himself, drawing the plans on butcher paper at the kitchen table of the log cabin where the family lived while the house was being built. The stone house was Marguerite's. It had always been Marguerite's. Her father had put it in her name before he died with a deed that specified in language that even Colette, who was not a lawyer, could understand, that the property was hers, absolutely, that it could not be transferred, sold, or alienated without her written consent. The deed had been drawn up and notarized in Jefferson City by a notary named Ellsworth Pratt, a man with no connection to the Calloways or the Braddocks or anyone else in Cardon County. The deed was Marguerite's shield. It was supposed to protect her. It was supposed to make sure that no matter what happened, no matter who she married, no matter who died, no matter what the men in town decided among themselves, the stone house on Cardon Hill would remain hers. But shields only work if the people around you respect them. When Cornelius Calloway died in 1853, Aldous Braddock saw an opportunity. He saw a widow with property and no male relatives to defend her claim. He saw a deed that had been filed in Jefferson City 150 miles away in an office where nobody in Cardon had ever been. And he saw a way to transfer the most valuable property in the county from a woman who owned it to a family that wanted it. Marguerite described what happened next with the precision of someone who knew she was writing for a future reader. She described how Braddock had come to her with a new document, a succession act, he called it, that he said was required by county law. She described how the document transferred the property from her name to the male heirs of the Calloway line in the event of her husband's death. She described how she had refused to sign it, and she described what happened when she refused. "They did not threaten me," Marguerite wrote. "That is what people do not understand. They did not raise their voices. They did not make demands. They simply proceeded as if I had agreed." Braddock filed the Succession Act with the county clerk. I went to the clerk's office and told him that I had not signed it. He showed me the document. There was a signature at the bottom. It was not my signature, but it looked enough like mine that the clerk, who had never seen my handwriting, accepted it without question. Colette put the notebook down. She sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling and breathed. A forged signature, just like Harlon's will. The same trick, the same family, the same office, 30 years apart, and nothing had changed except the names. "They forged her signature," Colette said. "Yes," Whitford said. He did not sound surprised. He sounded tired the way a man sounds when a suspicion he has carried for decades is finally confirmed, and the confirmation brings no relief, only the weight of knowing for certain. Colette picked up the notebook and kept reading. Marguerite had not given up. That was the thing that struck Colette most powerfully as she turned the pages, the refusal to give up. Marguerite had written letters, dozens of them, to lawyers in Jefferson City, to the county judge, to a state representative whose name she had found in a newspaper. Most of the letters went unanswered. The few responses she received were polite and empty, the kind of responses that institutions give when they want a problem to go away without the inconvenience of solving it. She had found one lawyer who seemed willing to help. His name was Theodore Arkin, a young attorney in St. Louis, who had a reputation for taking cases that other lawyers wouldn't touch. Marguerite had written to him, and he had written back. And for a few weeks in the autumn of 1854, she had believed that someone was finally going to listen. Then Arkin stopped writing. No explanation. No final letter. Just silence. Marguerite sent 3 more letters. None were answered. She sent a 4th by registered mail, and it was returned unopened. I believe Arkin was paid to stay silent, Marguerite wrote. I cannot prove it, but I have learned that there are things in this world that do not require proof to be true. They require only the willingness to see them. After Arkin's silence, something changed in the notebook. The entries became shorter. The handwriting, which had been so disciplined, began to loosen. There were gaps, weeks, sometimes months, without a single word. And when the entries resumed, they were different. Less angry, more resigned. The voice of a woman who was running out of fight. She wrote about the daily humiliations, how the Calloway relatives who now controlled the property would come and go without acknowledging her, how meals were served at times when she was not present, how her belongings were moved from one room to another without her permission, each move pushing her further into the margins of her own home. How the hired help people she had known for years began to look through her, as if she were a piece of furniture that had been left behind by a previous owner. I am becoming invisible, Marguerite wrote in an entry dated June 1858. Not all at once, slowly, the way a stone becomes smooth in a river. They are wearing me away. Colette read that line and had to stop. She put the notebook down and pressed her hands flat against the table and breathed through her nose slowly, the way you breathe when you are trying to keep something inside from breaking loose. It was not grief. It was not pity. It was rage. A rage so clean and so cold that it felt like clarity. Like the first sharp breath of winter air, like the moment when you stop being confused about what is happening and understand it completely. They had done the same thing to Marguerite that they were doing to her. The same family, the same methods, the same quiet, systematic erasure of a woman who had the misfortune of existing in a world where the men who wrote the documents also decided who the documents protected. Whitford watched her from across the table. He said nothing. He understood what she was feeling because he had felt a version of it himself. 21 years ago, standing in the hallway of this same house, watching Marguerite Calloway move through her own rooms like a ghost. After a long moment, Colette picked up the notebook again. She turned to the last pages. The final entries were sparse. 1 or 2 lines, sometimes just a date and a few words. But the very last page was different. The handwriting was larger, unsteady. The letters pressed deep into the paper, as if the hand that wrote them was trembling with something beyond age or weakness. It was the handwriting of someone who was running out of time and knew it. The true deed is behind the mantelpiece, behind the left corner stone. If anyone finds this, know that the house is mine. It has always been mine. And they took it from me with a lie." Colette and Whitford looked at each other across the table. Then they both looked at the fireplace. Colette did not wait for Whitford to move first. She stood up, walked to the fireplace, and knelt on the stone floor in front of it. The mantelpiece was wide carved, darkened with decades of soot. She ran her hands along the left side, feeling the stones, feeling the mortar between them. Most of it was solid. But in the corner at the very edge where the mantelpiece met the wall, one stone was different. The mortar around it was softer, crumbling. When she pressed her thumb against it, she felt it give. She looked at Whitford. "Do you have a knife?" He reached into his coat and handed her a small folding knife from his medical bag. She opened it and worked the blade into the gap between the stones carefully, the way you pry open something that might be fragile. The stone shifted. She worked it back and forth, and then it came free, and behind it there was a hollow space in the wall, not large, about the size of a shoebox, and inside the space, wrapped in a piece of oiled cloth that had been placed there to protect against moisture, there was a document folded into quarters. Colette pulled it out. She unfolded it slowly, gently, the way you unfold something that has been waiting 21 years to be read. It was a deed. A notarized deed dated 1847, bearing the signatures of 2 witnesses and a notary from Jefferson City named Ellsworth Pratt. And on that deed, in clear, formal legal language, it was stated that the property known as the Stone House on Cardin Hill, situated in the township of Cardin, County of Cardin, State of Missouri, belonged in full and absolute ownership to Marguerite DeLorme, wife of Cornelius Calloway, as a family inheritance that could not be alienated. Inalienable. That was the word. It meant that no one could take it from her. Not legally, not without her consent. And yet, they had taken it. And the forged Succession Act of 1853 had been the instrument of that theft, passed from Aldous Braddock to the county clerk, to the Calloway family generation after generation, until it reached Harlon and then Leland, who now sat in a farmhouse that had never been his, believing he was safe. Colette held the deed in both hands. She looked at it for a long time. The paper was old, but intact. The ink was faded but legible. The signatures were clear. "This changes everything," she said. "This changes everything," Whitford confirmed. "But they will fight." "I know." Braddock is the notary for the whole family. His father forged the original document. He handled Harlan's succession. Leland has money connections, lawyers. "And I have this," Colette said, holding up the deed. "And I have your testimony that you saw where it was found. You're not a lawyer." "No. But do you know someone in St. Louis? A lawyer who isn't in the Calloway's pocket?" Whitford was quiet for a moment. He looked out the window at the hillside, at the wild grass bending in the April wind, and he thought about a debt he had owed for 21 years. "I know a man," he said. "Raphael de Sal. We studied together years ago. He's honest, which is rare, and he has no connection to anyone in Cardin." "Then write to him tonight," Colette said. It was not a request. It was not a plea. It was a woman telling a man what needed to happen next, and the man understanding that she was right. But before DeSalle arrived, before the legal machinery began to move, Colette had a harder reckoning to face, a private one. It happened on the fourth evening after finding the deed. She was sitting at the oak table, the deed and the notebook in front of her, when she noticed something she had missed before. In the trunk from the cellar, beneath the layer of yellowed linen where the notebook had been, there was an envelope. Not Marguerite's. The handwriting on the front was different. It was a handwriting Colette recognized instantly because she had seen it every day for 4 years on shopping lists and feed orders and the occasional letter to a cousin in Springfield. It was Harlon's handwriting. The envelope was unsealed. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded once. A letter unfinished, undated, never sent. "Colette," it began. "There are things about this house I should have told you. Things I learned from my mother before she died. Things the family made me swear never to speak of. I have kept that promise for too long, and I'm not sure I can keep it much longer. The house on the hill is not what they say it is. It belongs to—" The letter stopped there, mid-sentence, as if Harlon had been interrupted or had lost his nerve or had decided that the cost of truth was still too high. Colette read it 3 times. She read it sitting at the table. She read it standing by the window. She read it sitting on the floor in front of the fireplace where the deed had been hidden. And each time she read it, she felt something shift inside her. Something that had been settled and was now unsettled, like a bone that had healed crooked and needed to be broken again to set it right. Harlon had known. He had known the truth about the house. He had known what had been done to his mother. He had known that the deed was hidden behind the stone, and he had kept it secret. He had sat beside Colette at that kitchen table night after night, year after year, and he had never said a word. Why? Because the family had made him swear. Because the cost of speaking was too high. Because he was a man who was decent, but not brave, who was kind but not strong, who loved his wife in the quiet way that quiet men love, but could not bring himself to risk everything for the sake of the truth. Colette sat with that knowledge for a long time. She did not hate Harlon for it. Hate was too simple, too clean, too much like the villain in a story, and Harlon had never been a villain. He had been a man, a flawed, frightened, ordinary man who had made the choice that most ordinary men make when they are caught between the truth and the people who raised them. She thought about the nights in the farmhouse, the lamplight, the silence between them that she had always read as contentment, but now understood as something else entirely. She thought about the times Harlon had started to say something and stopped. The times he had looked at her across the table with that expression she could never quite name. Not sadness, not guilt, but something close to both, something that lived in the space between what a person knows and what a person is willing to say. He had wanted to tell her. She believed that. The letter was proof. He had sat down with paper and ink and he had started the sentence that would have changed everything. And then he had stopped. Maybe Leland had knocked on the door. Maybe Prosper had called from the porch. Or maybe the weight of 30 years of family silence had simply been too heavy for one man to lift alone. She would never know. And that was the cruelest part. Not the betrayal itself, but the incompleteness of it. The unfinished sentence. The truth that almost made it to the surface and then sank back down. But she was angry. Not the hot, loud anger that burns and fades. The other kind. the kind that settles into your bones and becomes part of your structure, part of the architecture of who you are, the kind that does not burn out because it is not fed by emotion, but by clarity. She understood now completely what she was fighting against. Not just Leland, not just Braddock. She was fighting against a silence that had been built and maintained and defended for 30 years. A silence that had swallowed Marguerite and almost swallowed Harlon, and was now reaching for her. She was not going to be swallowed. She put Harlan's letter back in the envelope. She placed it inside the notebook, and she made her decision. She was going to court. The weeks that followed were the hardest of Colette's life, and perhaps the most alive she had ever felt. She continued to live in the stone house, not because she had no choice, though she didn't, but because she understood now that this was her ground, that this was Marguerite's ground, and that leaving it even for a night would be a concession she could not afford. She repaired the boarded windows herself, pulling the old planks loose and replacing them with boards. She planned from lumber she found in the stable. She cleared a section of the wild garden and turned the soil for a kitchen plot. The cow, whom she had started calling the Brown, because naming things made them more real, began to give more milk now that she had fresh grass and clean water and a stable that didn't leak. Colette sold the extra milk to the baker, Clyde Sumner, who came up the hill every morning. With the milk money, she bought 2 chickens from a farmer on the South Road. The chickens gave eggs. The eggs gave her protein and something to trade. Slowly, imperceptibly, the economy of her survival began to take shape. A small, fierce economy built on barter and labor, and the stubborn refusal to disappear. And every evening after the work was done, after the cow was fed, and the chickens were penned and the fire was burning in the stove, Colette sat at the oak table and read Marguerite's notebook. She read it the way you read letters from a friend you have never met, with attention, with sadness, with a calm rage that gave her energy when everything else should have been taking it away. She read about Marguerite's garden, the roses she had planted along the south wall, the herb beds she had tended with the precision of someone who understood that growing things was an act of defiance against a world that wanted to take everything away. She read about Marguerite's son Harlon, though he was never named in the notebook, only my boy, my child, as if Marguerite could not bring herself to connect the child she loved with the family name that had destroyed her. She read about loneliness. Not the dramatic loneliness of stories, but the quiet, grinding loneliness of a woman who lived in a house full of people who refused to see her. The loneliness of eating alone in a kitchen that had once been hers. The loneliness of walking through rooms that bore her furniture, her curtains, her wallpaper, and feeling like a stranger. The loneliness of growing old in a place where no one would remember her. And sometimes late at night when the fire had burned low, and the silence of the hilltop pressed against the windows like something alive, Colette would close the notebook and sit very still and feel the presence of Marguerite in the room. Not a ghost, not a spirit, something quieter than that, a resonance. The feeling that the walls of this house remembered the woman who had built them, and that by sitting here, by reading her words, by refusing to leave Colette, was keeping that memory alive. Others came too. Odette Farrow arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in late April, climbing the hill road with the steady, unhurried pace of a woman who had been climbing hills her entire life and did not intend to stop now. She was 76 years old. She was thin and straight-backed, and her white hair was pulled tight under a cotton bonnet that she had worn every day for as long as anyone could remember. She had been the housekeeper for the Calloway family 20 years ago, when Marguerite was still alive and she had seen things that she had never told anyone. She came without warning and without invitation. She stood at the gate and called out, and when Colette came to meet her, Odette looked her up and down with sharp, dark eyes and said, "So you're the one who stayed." "I'm the one who stayed," Colette said. "Good. I have things to tell you." They sat at the oak table and Odette told her. She told her about Marguerite, not the legal story, not the documents and the forgery, but the human story. How Marguerite had been a woman of warmth and intelligence, who had loved her garden and her books and her son. How the family had treated her after Cornelius died with the slow, methodical cruelty of people who do not consider what they are doing to be cruel, because they have convinced themselves that they are simply following the natural order. How Marguerite had grown thinner and quieter and more translucent with each passing year, as if she were being erased not just from the property records, but from the physical world. She used to sit in that chair, Odette said, pointing to the chair Colette was sitting in. She used to read by the window. She was always reading. I think the books were the last things they couldn't take from her. "Why didn't you say anything?" Colette asked. Not with accusation, with genuine curiosity. "Because I was a housekeeper," Odette said. "And housekeepers who talk about the families they work for don't stay housekeepers for long. I had 3 children to feed. I had rent to pay. I made the choice I made, and I've lived with it." She paused. "But I'm 76 now. My children are grown. My rent is paid. And I'm tired of living with it." Then came Phineas Locke. Locke was the young school teacher at the Carden schoolhouse, 26 years old. Thin earnest with round spectacles and a habit of speaking in complete sentences that made some people in town think he was putting on airs. He was not putting on airs. He was simply a man who cared about precision, about saying exactly what he meant, and who had not yet learned that in small towns precision is often mistaken for arrogance. Locke came to Colette not because of Marguerite, but because of something he had seen with his own eyes. One evening, 3 weeks after Harlon's death, he had been walking past the Calloway farmhouse, Leland's farmhouse now, and he had seen Leland's brother-in-law hand an envelope to Haskell Braddock through the side door. Not the front door. The side door, the one that opened onto the alley behind the feed store. The door that people used when they didn't want to be seen. "I don't know what was in the envelope," Locke told Colette, "but I know what it looked like. It looked like payment." Each visitor brought a fragment. Colette collected the fragments the way a woman stitches a quilt piece by piece, square by square, until the pattern becomes visible, and the thing that was scattered becomes whole. And then DeSalle arrived. Raphael DeSalle came from St. Louis on a Thursday morning in early May. He was 45 years old, built like a man who had done physical work before he picked up law books, with a salt and pepper beard and eyes that did not blink when they should have. He had the manner of someone who had spent his career in courtrooms and had learned that the law was not a system of justice, but a system of leverage, and that the difference between winning and losing was usually the difference between having leverage and not having it. Whitford met him at the train station in the neighboring town and brought him up the hill on horseback. DeSalle looked at the stone house, looked at the view of the valley below, looked at the half-collapsed tower, and the wild garden and the cow grazing in the cleared patch of yard, and he said nothing for a full minute. Then he said, "Show me everything." Colette showed him the notebook, the deed, Harlon's unfinished letter. She told him about Odette Farrow, about Phineas Locke, about the envelope passed through the side door. DeSalle listened without interrupting. He took notes in a small leather book with a pencil that he sharpened with a penknife between sections. When she was finished, he closed his book and looked at her. "It's a solid case," he said. "Not certain. Nothing is ever certain in a courtroom. But solid. What do we need to do? File a petition with the county court to challenge the 1853 Succession Act and the 1882 will. Present the original deed. Call witnesses. And hope the judge is honest. And if he isn't," DeSalle looked at her steadily, "then we appeal. And we do it again. Because the truth, Mrs. Calloway, has one advantage over a lie. It doesn't get tired." But DeSalle also told her something else. Something that changed the shape of the fight. "Leland Calloway is in debt," he said. "Serious debt. He borrowed against the farm, Harlon's farm, the one he inherited, to invest in a railroad venture out of Kansas City. The venture collapsed 6 months ago. He's behind on his payments. If he loses the farm, he loses everything. And the farm's value is tied to the Calloway name, which is tied to the property on this hill. You're saying he's desperate. I'm saying desperate men do desperate things. Watch yourself, Mrs. Calloway." Colette watched herself, but it was not enough. It happened on a Wednesday night in the 3rd week of May, when the air smelled of honeysuckle, and the sky was clear, and the stars above Cardin Hill were bright enough to read by. Colette woke to the smell of smoke, not wood smoke, not the warm, clean smell of the stove or the fireplace. This was different. This was sharp and chemical and wrong. She was on her feet before she was fully awake, pulling on her boots, grabbing the blanket from the floor and running outside. The stable was on fire. The flames were coming from the back wall, where someone had stacked dry hay against the timber frame and lit it. The fire was already climbing the wall, eating the old wood with a sound like tearing cloth. Inside the stable, the brown was screaming a sound that Colette had never heard a cow make, a sound of pure animal terror. She didn't think. She ran to the stable door and threw it open, and the heat hit her face like a hand. She could see the brown through the smoke pulling against her rope, her eyes white and wild. Colette went in. She grabbed the rope and yanked the knot free and pulled the cow out through the door. And the cow came stumbling and bellowing, and they both fell into the courtyard as a section of the stable roof collapsed behind them in a shower of sparks. Colette got to her feet. She grabbed the blanket and went back. Not for the cow. For the fire. She beat at the flames on the ground where they were spreading toward the main house, and she beat at them until the blanket was burning in her hands, and she dropped it and stamped on the embers with her boots, and she kept stamping until there was nothing left to stamp on. When it was over, she stood in the courtyard with her hands hanging at her sides. Her palms were burned. The skin was raw and blistered across both hands, and the pain was starting to come now, pushing through the adrenaline like light through a crack. The stable was destroyed. The back wall of the main house was scorched but intact. The Browns stood 20 feet away, Trembling, her hide singed on one flank but alive, Colette looked at her burned hands. She looked at the smoldering ruin of the stable. She looked down the hill toward the town, toward the dark rooftops where someone was sleeping right now, who had sent someone else to do this. She did not cry. She did not scream. She stood there, in the dark, in the smell of smoke and burned wood and her own scorched skin, and she felt the anger settle deeper into her bones, past the muscle, past the marrow, into the place where decisions live. Whitford came at dawn. Someone in the valley had seen the glow and sent word. He found Colette sitting on the stone wall of the courtyard, her hands wrapped in wet rags. The cow beside her, the ruins of the stable still smoking. He didn't ask what happened. He could see what happened. He sat down beside her and opened his medical bag and began to clean and bandage her hands. He worked in silence. When he was finished, he looked at her. "They want you to run," he said. "I know what they want," Colette said. Her voice was flat, calm, empty of everything except the one thing that mattered. "But this hill is mine and Marguerite's, and I am done running." The fire changed things in the town. Not the way Colette had hoped, but the way things actually change in small communities, unevenly, unpredictably, with loyalties splitting along lines that nobody had drawn in advance. Some people were outraged. The baker, Clyde Sumner, came up the hill the next morning with bread and a hammer and spent the afternoon helping Colette build a temporary shelter for the Brown out of salvaged lumber. A farmer named Hollis Reed, who lived on the North Road and had never spoken to Colette before, left a sack of grain at the gate without a note, but others pulled back. The minister at the church, Reverend Aldrich, the same man who had spoken at Harlon's funeral, stood in his pulpit the following Sunday and delivered a sermon about the proper order of things. He did not mention Colette by name. He did not need to. He spoke about the wisdom of accepting one's station, about the dangers of pride, about the fact that God had created a natural hierarchy, and that those who sought to overturn it were setting themselves against his will. It was a sermon that everyone in the congregation understood. The wives understood it. The farmers understood it. The shopkeepers who depended on Callaway business understood it especially well. The message was simple: Colette Morrow Callaway was a disruption. And disruptions in small towns had consequences not just for the person who caused them, but for everyone who stood too close. Some people moved away from her. The woman who ran the dry goods store, who had been friendly enough before, now looked past Colette when she came through the door. The postmaster, who had been holding Colette's mail at the counter, began leaving it in a pile on the back shelf, where it sometimes got lost. Small cruelties. The kind that don't leave marks but wear you down the way water wears stone, not by force, but by persistence. But the fire had also cracked something open in the town that could not be sealed back shut. 3 families left food at the base of the hill road, anonymously at night, wrapped in cloth with no note attached. A retired carpenter named Emmett Voss appeared at the gate one morning with a bag of nails and a saw, and said only, "Heard you needed a stable." He worked for 2 days and would not accept payment. When Colette asked him why, he said, "Because my wife told me to come, and my wife is usually right about things." Colette heard about the sermon from the baker. She did not react. She was learning that in a fight like this, reaction was a luxury she could not afford. Every response she gave would be measured and used and twisted. Silence was sometimes the strongest statement. and she had work to do. But the fire had done something else. Something Leland Calloway had not anticipated. It had made people curious. Before the fire, Colette was a widow living in a ruin, and people could feel sorry for her or ignore her as they chose. After the fire, she was a widow living in a ruin that someone had tried to burn down, and that raised a question that small towns cannot resist. Why? Why would someone try to drive a woman off a worthless hill? What was up there that mattered? The question spread through Cardon the way smoke spreads through a house slowly. At first, finding every crack, every opening, every space where air could carry it. And Leland, who had wanted silence, had accidentally created noise. Then came the thing Colette had not expected. The blow that was aimed not at her, but at Whitford. It happened a week before the court date. Whitford was in his office on Elm Street cleaning his instruments when Haskell Braddock walked in without knocking. Braddock removed his hat. He placed it on the edge of Whitford's desk. He sat down in the patient's chair, and he said in his dry, precise notarial voice the following words. "Dr. Whitford, I understand you intend to testify at the hearing regarding the Calloway property." "I do," Whitford said. "I would ask you to reconsider." "On what grounds?" Braddock adjusted his spectacles. He looked at Whitford the way a man looks at a card. He is about to play a card he has been holding for a long time, waiting for exactly the right moment. In 1867, Braddock said you treated a man named James Caulfield for a chest complaint. You prescribed a tincture of digitalis. The dosage was incorrect. Caulfield died 3 days later. His family was told it was heart failure. You and I both know that it was not. The room was very quiet. The clock on the wall ticked. Outside, a dog barked somewhere on Elm Street, and the sound seemed to come from very far away. "I have the pharmacy records," Braddock said. "I have the death certificate you signed, and I have a sworn statement from the pharmacist who filled the prescription, who noted at the time that the dosage seemed unusual. He is retired now, living in Springfield, but he is willing to speak if asked." Whitford said nothing. His hands were still. His face was still. But behind his eyes, something was moving, something old and heavy and familiar. The same weight he had carried for 15 years. The weight of a mistake that had cost a man his life. It had been an error. A genuine, terrible human error. He had been tired 3 days without sleep. An outbreak of scarlet fever in the county. Too many patients and not enough hours. He had written the wrong number on the prescription. 12 drops instead of 2. He had realized it the next day, but by then it was too late. Caulfield was dead. Whitford had lived with that mistake every day since. He had not reported it because reporting it would have ended his career, his life in Cardon, everything he had built. He had told himself that it was one mistake in 20 years of careful work, that the good he had done outweighed the harm, that confession would serve no purpose except to destroy him. And now Braddock was sitting in his office holding that mistake like a knife, offering him a simple trade, his silence for his complicity. "Think about it," Braddock said. He picked up his hat. He put it on his head. He walked to the door and stopped. "The hearing is in 1 week. A great deal can change in a week." He left. Whitford sat at his desk for a long time. He thought about James Caulfield. He thought about Marguerite Calloway. He thought about the stone house on the hill and the woman who was living there, and the deed that was hidden behind the mantelpiece, and the notebook that told the truth about everything. And he thought about the fact that silence, once you start, never stops asking for more. That evening, he rode up the hill. Colette was in the courtyard feeding the chickens. Her hands were still bandaged. She moved carefully, using her wrists and the heels of her palms compensating for the burns with the same quiet adaptability that she brought to everything. Whitford dismounted. He tied his horse to the gate. He walked to where she stood, and he told her everything. The prescription, the dosage, Caulfield's death, Braddock's visit, the threat. He told her all of it, standing in the courtyard of the stone house as the sun went down behind the hills, and the light turned the color of old gold, and when he was finished, he waited for her to say something. And what she said was not what he expected. "I'm not asking you to be perfect, Silas," she said. "I'm asking you to be honest. You decide." She did not tell him what to do. She did not plead. She did not appeal to his guilt, or his courage, or his sense of duty. She gave him the one thing that Marguerite had never been given, that Colette herself had almost never been given, the thing that the Calloways and the Braddocks had spent 30 years denying to every woman who crossed their path. She gave him a choice. Whitford stood in the courtyard and looked at the stone house. He looked at the scorched wall where the stable had been. He looked at the cow grazing in the yard, and the chickens pecking at the ground, and the garden plot where the first green shoots were pushing through the turned soil. "I'll testify," he said. Colette nodded. She did not thank him. Thanks were not what this moment required. What this moment required was acknowledgement, the simple recognition that a man had been given a choice between his comfort and his conscience, and he had chosen his conscience. She turned back to the chickens. Whitford mounted his horse. He rode down the hill in the failing light, and behind him on the crest of Carden Hill the stone house stood against the darkening sky, like something that had decided after 21 years of silence to speak. The night before the hearing, Colette did not sleep. She lay on the straw mattress she had made in the upstairs room, the room with the window that faced east, the room where the dawn came first, and she stared at the ceiling and listened to the sounds of the house, the creak of the beams settling, the faint scratch of something small moving inside the walls, the wind pressing against the glass with the steady, patient insistence of something that wanted to come in but was willing to wait. She was not nervous. That surprised her. She had expected to feel the flutter of anxiety, the tightening in the chest, the racing mind that comes before the moments that determine everything. But what she felt instead was something closer to stillness. The stillness of a woman who has already done everything she can do, and now has only to walk forward and see what happens. She thought about Marguerite. She had been thinking about Marguerite every day for weeks now. But tonight the thoughts were different. Not the legal Marguerite, not the wronged Marguerite, not the Marguerite of documents and deeds and courtroom arguments. She thought about the woman, the person who had sat in this same house in this same silence, and who had known that the truth was hidden behind a stone in the fireplace, and that she might die before anyone found it. What kind of courage did that take? Not the courage of action that was Colette's kind. The courage of doing, of moving, of fighting. But the courage of patience. The courage of writing something down and hiding it and trusting that someday, somehow, someone would come along who would find it and understand it and finish what you could not finish yourself. Marguerite had waited 21 years. She had waited in silence in stone in the dark space behind the mantelpiece. And Colette had come. At dawn, she got up. She washed her face with cold water from the basin. She put on her mourning dress, the same black dress she had worn since the day of Harlon's funeral. The same dress she had worn when the carriage left her at the bottom of the hill. The same dress she had worn when she knelt in front of the fireplace and pulled the deed from behind the stone. She had not bought a new dress. She could not afford one, and even if she could, she would not have wanted one. The black dress was not about mourning anymore. It had become something else. It had become a statement, a record, a piece of cloth that carried the weight of everything she had survived. And she was going to wear it into that courtroom the way a soldier wears a uniform, not for decoration, but for identity. She looked at herself in the small mirror she had hung on the wall. She looked thinner than she remembered, harder. The softness that had been in her face when she was a wife on a farm had been burned away by the weeks on the hill, burned by work, by fire, by the slow, relentless process of becoming someone she had not known she could be. She picked up the deed. She picked up Marguerite's notebook. She placed them both in a leather satchel that DeSalle had given her. She went downstairs, fed the chickens, gave the brown fresh water, and checked the new stable that Emmett Voss had built. Everything was in order. Everything would hold. Then she walked down the hill. It was the first time she had walked down since the day she had walked up. The county courthouse sat on the east end of Main Street in the neighboring town of Meridian, 12 miles from Cardon. It was a 2-story brick building with tall windows and a portico held up by 4 white columns that were supposed to look like something from ancient Greece, but looked more like something from a catalog. The courtroom was on the 2nd floor, a large room with walls the color of cold tobacco. Wooden benches arranged in rows and windows that looked out onto a cobblestone courtyard where pigeons walked slowly in the morning light, as if they knew they had nowhere in particular to be. DeSalle had arranged for a wagon to bring Colette and Whitford from Cardon. They arrived at 8:30. The hearing was set for 9. DeSalle was already there, standing on the courthouse steps, with his leather case under his arm, and the look of a man who had prepared thoroughly and was now simply waiting for the thing to begin. Colette climbed the steps. She paused at the top and looked back at the street below the shop fronts. The horses tied to the hitching posts, the people going about their mourning as if this were any other Tuesday. It was not any other Tuesday. But the world did not care about that, and Colette had learned not to expect it to. Inside the courtroom smelled of old wood and lamp oil, and the faint, sour residue of every argument that had ever been made within its walls. The benches were already filling. Word had spread not just in Cardon, but in the surrounding towns. The way word always spreads when a case involves property and family, and the kind of scandal that people pretend to disapprove of, but cannot stop talking about. Leland Calloway was already seated on the right side of the aisle. He wore a gray suit made of fine wool, a suit that cost more than the monthly wage of half the men in the room. His face was composed. His hands were folded in his lap. He looked like a man who had come to a social function, not a courtroom, and who expected the event to conclude in his favor, the way such events always concluded in his favor. Beside him sat Haskell Braddock. Braddock was calm, not the calm of serenity, but the calm of control, the practiced professional calm of a man who had spent 40 years managing difficult situations and who knew the difference between a crisis and an inconvenience. He had a folder open on his lap, and his spectacles perched on the end of his nose, and the air of someone who was already composing the closing argument in his head. Colette sat down on the left side of the aisle. DeSalle took the chair beside her. Behind them in the second row sat Silas Whitford. His face was still. His hands were steady. But Colette could see in the slight tension of his jaw, in the way he held his shoulders, that the decision he had made on the hilltop was still costing him, was still pressing against the inside of his chest like something that needed to get out. Odette Farrow sat in the third row. She had come early before anyone else, and she sat with her hands folded in her lap and her back straight, and her eyes fixed on the front of the room with the focused attention of a woman who had been waiting a very long time for this moment and did not intend to miss a single second of it. Phineas Locke sat beside her. He had closed the schoolhouse for the day, the first time he had ever done so, and he had ridden the 12 miles from Cardon to Meridian without telling anyone where he was going. He sat with his round spectacles slightly crooked and a notebook of his own open on his knee, because Phineas Locke was the kind of man who believed that important things should be written down, and he intended to write down every word spoken in this room. There were others, too. The baker, Clyde Sumner, stood at the back of the gallery, his hat in his hands, his flour-dusted apron replaced for the first time in memory by a clean coat. Emmett Voss, the carpenter who had rebuilt the stable, sat near the window with his wife. The wife who had told him to go up the hill. The wife who was usually right. And scattered among the benches were faces that Colette recognized from the town people she had seen from a distance, but never spoken to people who had come not because they knew her, but because they had heard the story and wanted to see how it ended. She noticed all of this. She noticed it with the hyper-aware clarity that comes in the moments before something irreversible happens. The way the light fell through the tall windows in long diagonal bars. The way the dust motes drifted in those bars, like tiny worlds with no gravity. The way the wooden benches creaked when people shifted their weight. She noticed the smell of the room-old wood lamp oil, the collective warmth of too many bodies in a space with not enough air. And she noticed her own breathing steady and slow, the breathing of a woman who had made her peace with whatever was about to happen. She had done everything she could. She had found the truth, she had gathered the witnesses, she had hired the lawyer, she had survived the fire. Everything that came after this was out of her hands. And there was a strange freedom in that. The freedom of having nothing left to do but sit still and let the world decide whether it was gonna be fair. The judge entered at 9 o'clock exactly. His name was Edmund Ferrars. He was 60 years old with thick spectacles and a thin face, and the habit of looking at people over the top of his glasses as if the lenses were not strong enough for the kind of seeing he needed to do. He moved slowly, deliberately, the way judges move when they want the room to understand that the pace of this proceeding belongs to them. Ferrars was known for two things. The first was his intelligence, which was considerable. The second was his incorruptibility, which was not the result of moral superiority, but of simple economics. He was wealthy enough to have no needs, and a man with no needs is a man who cannot be bought. The Callaways had tried, according to DeSalle, through intermediaries, through suggestions, through the careful, indirect language of men who want to purchase a verdict without leaving fingerprints. Ferrers had not responded. "This court is in session," Ferrers said. "The matter before us is a petition filed by Colette Morrow Calloway challenging the Succession Act of 1853 pertaining to the property known as the Stone House on Carden Hill, and the testamentary disposition of 1882 pertaining to the estate of Harlon James Calloway. Mr. DeSalle, you may proceed." DeSalle stood. He buttoned his coat. He walked to the front of the room with the unhurried confidence of a man who knows exactly what he is going to say, and exactly when he is going to say it. He began with the deed. He held it up, the document that had been hidden behind the mantelpiece for 21 years. The document that Marguerite DeLorme Calloway had placed there, with trembling hands in the last months of her life. He described the conditions of its discovery. He described the trunk, the notebook, the indication on the final page. He described the notary who had drawn up the deed in Jefferson City, a man named Ellsworth Pratt, who had no connection to anyone in Carden County. He described the language of the deed, the word inalienable, what it meant, what it was supposed to protect. Then he called his first witness. Silas Whitford walked to the front of the room. He sat down in the witness chair. He placed his hands on his knees, and he began to speak in the same calm, measured voice he used in his medical practice, the voice of a man who was accustomed to delivering difficult truths, and who had learned that the best way to deliver them was without ornament. He described his visit to the stone house. He described finding Colette there, working, surviving. He described the notebook and his recognition of Marguerite's name. He described reading the journal together, finding the indication on the last page, removing the stone from the mantelpiece, and discovering the deed. He spoke clearly, precisely, without embellishment. He did not editorialize. He did not speculate. He said what he had seen and what he had done, and he let the facts carry their own weight. Then Braddock stood to cross-examine. Braddock was good. Colette had known he would be, but knowing it and watching it were different things. He moved through his questions with the smooth, practiced efficiency of a man who had been doing this for decades. Each question building on the last, each one designed to create a small crack in the foundation of the testimony. He asked Whitford about his relationship with Colette. Was he a friend? A frequent visitor, could his testimony be considered impartial? Whitford answered steadily. He was a physician. He had attended to Harlon Calloway during his final illness. He had visited the stone house as a professional courtesy. His testimony was based on what he had observed, not on any personal attachment. Then Braddock changed direction. He leaned forward slightly, adjusted his spectacles, and said in a voice that was almost conversational, almost friendly, "Dr. Whitford, you are a man of considerable experience in this community, a man of reputation, a man whose word carries weight." "I try to be," Whitford said. "And would you say that a man's word is only as reliable as his character?" "I would." "Then let me ask you about your character, Doctor." Braddock paused. The pause was theatrical, and everyone in the room knew it. And it worked anyway. "In 1867, you treated a man named James Caulfield for a chest complaint. Do you recall?" The room shifted. It was a small shift. A straightening of backs, a turning of heads. The collective intake of breath that happens when a courtroom senses that something unexpected is about to occur. Whitford was quiet for 3 seconds. 3 seconds that felt like a minute. He looked at Braddock. He looked at the judge. He looked at Colette, who sat perfectly still. Her hands folded, her eyes steady. And then he did the thing that nobody expected. "Yes," Whitford said. "I recall. I prescribed a tincture of digitalis. The dosage was incorrect. 12 drops instead of 2. James Caulfield died 3 days later. I signed the death certificate as heart failure. It was not heart failure. It was my mistake." The room went completely silent. Not the silence of surprise. It was past surprise now. It was the silence of recognition. The silence that comes when a man stands up in front of a room full of people and tells the truth about the worst thing he has ever done. Whitford continued. His voice did not waver. His hands did not shake. He spoke the way a man speaks when he has been carrying something for 15 years and has finally decided to set it down. "I made a mistake," he said. "A terrible mistake. A man died because of my carelessness, and I did not report it. I did not report it because I was afraid of losing my practice, my reputation, my place in this community. I have carried that silence for 15 years. And I am here today because I have learned too late, maybe, but I have learned that silence does not protect you. It consumes you. I will not carry another silence. I am here to tell the truth about what I saw in that house. And the truth is that the deed is genuine. The notebook is genuine. And the property on Carden Hill was stolen from Marguerite Calloway by means of a forged document." He looked directly at Braddock. "And Mr. Braddock knows that, because his father was the one who forged it." The courtroom erupted. Not in shouting, this was not a theatrical eruption, but in the low, rolling murmur of dozens of people processing something extraordinary at the same time. Judge Ferrers tapped his gavel once firmly, and the murmur subsided. But the energy in the room had changed permanently. Something had cracked open, and it was not going to close again. Colette watched Whitford walk back to his seat. He moved differently now, lighter, as if the thing he had been carrying, the weight of Caulfield, the weight of Marguerite, the weight of 21 years of knowing and not speaking, had finally been set down, not gently, not gracefully, but completely in front of a room full of strangers who would judge him for it, and whom he no longer had the energy to fear. He sat down beside her. He did not look at her. He looked straight ahead at the judge's bench with the empty, calm expression of a man who has just done the hardest thing he will ever do, and is still alive, and is waiting to find out what that means. Colette said nothing, but she shifted in her seat just slightly, just enough that her shoulder was closer to his, not touching but present. It was the smallest gesture she could make, and it was enough. Whitford's breathing steadied. His hands unclenched. Braddock recovered quickly. He had to. He was a professional, and professionals do not let a single moment, however devastating, derail their strategy. He returned to his arguments, the age of the deed, the difficulty of verifying a document that had been hidden for 2 decades, the legal principle of prescription, which held that a claim unchallenged for 25 years could not be reopened. It was a good argument. It was the kind of argument that wins cases not because it is right, but because it is procedurally sound, because the law, like all systems built by men, sometimes favors order over justice. Then DeSalle called Odette Farrow. The old woman stood up from her bench in the third row. She walked to the front of the room without a cane, without assistance, without the slightest hesitation. She was 76 years old, and she moved with the unhurried dignity of a woman who had spent her entire life serving other people and had decided on this particular morning to serve the truth instead. She sat down in the witness chair. She folded her hands. She looked at Judge Ferrers with clear, dark eyes. "State your name and your connection to this matter," Ferrers said. "My name is Odette Farrow. I was the housekeeper at the Stone House on Carden Hill from 1855 to 1862. I worked for the Calloway family. I knew Marguerite Calloway. I was there when she died." DeSalle guided her through her testimony with the patience of a man who understood that the most powerful thing in the room was not a document or a legal argument, but an old woman's memory. Odette told them about Marguerite. She told them how Marguerite had tended the garden and read books by the window and loved her son with the quiet, fierce devotion of a mother who knew she was being erased from her own life. She told them how the family had moved Marguerite from room to room, each room smaller than the last. Each move a demotion disguised as practicality. She told them about the meals served when Marguerite was absent, the conversations held in rooms she was not invited to enter, the slow, systematic reduction of a woman to a shadow in her own house. And then she told them about the night she overheard Aldous Braddock. "It was December of 1858, Odette said. I was in the pantry. Mr. Braddock was in the parlor with Cornelius's brother. They did not know I was there. Mr. Braddock said, and I remember his exact words because I have been hearing them in my head for 26 years, he said, 'The Calloway woman will never see a thing, because women alone only see what they are allowed to see.'" She paused. She looked at Braddock, the son, not the father. And in that look there was something that went beyond accusation. It was the look of a woman who had been carrying someone else's secret for a quarter of a century and was now finally giving it back. "His son is sitting right there," Odette said. "And I imagine he heard his father say similar things many times." Braddock did not respond. His face did not change. But his hands, which had been resting on his folder, moved to his lap where no one could see them. And Colette, who was watching closely, noticed that the knuckles were white. The cross-examination of Odette was brief. Braddock challenged her memory. She was an elderly woman, after all, recalling events from decades ago. He suggested that the passage of time had distorted her recollections, that emotions had colored her testimony, that the words she attributed to his father might have been misheard or misremembered. Odette listened to each question. She answered each one the same way, calmly, directly, without defensiveness. When Braddock suggested that her memory might be unreliable, she said, "Mr. Braddock, I am 76 years old. My legs are not what they were. My eyes are not what they were. But my memory is perfectly clear. I remember what your father said, because it was the cruelest thing I had ever heard one person say about another. And cruel things, in my experience, are the things you remember longest." The gallery murmured. Ferrers did not use his gavel. Braddock returned to his seat. He opened his folder. He began his formal defense. The procedural arguments, the statute of limitations. the chain of custody questions about the deed. He spoke well. He spoke persuasively. He built his case the way a mason builds a wall. Brick by careful brick, each argument fitted precisely against the last. And then DeSalle played his final card. "Your Honor," he said, "I would like to present one additional piece of evidence." He reached into his leather case and produced a second document, a letter. Old paper, faded ink, folded and unfolded many times over the years. He handed it to the court clerk, who passed it to the judge. This letter, DeSalle said, was found in the archived files of a notary in Jefferson City who died 10 years ago. His name was Ellsworth Pratt, the same notary who drew up the original deed for Marguerite DeLorme. When Mr. Pratt died, his files were transferred to his successor, a man named Winslow, who cataloged them. When I began my research into this case, I contacted Mr. Winslow and asked whether the Pratt files contained anything related to the Callaway property. He found this letter. The letter was dated October 1853. It was addressed to Aldous Braddock, and it said in language that was barely veiled enough to maintain the pretense of propriety that the original deed of property in the name of Marguerite DeLorme had been found inconvenient by the Callaway heirs, and that the notary in Cardin, meaning Aldous Braddock, would be suitably compensated for his professional services in resolving the matter. DeSalle read the letter aloud. He read it slowly, clearly, making sure that every word reached every corner of the room. When he finished, the silence was different from any silence that had come before. It was not the silence of surprise or shock or even anger. It was the silence of understanding, the silence of a room full of people who had just heard the final piece of a puzzle click into place. Judge Ferrers examined the letter over his spectacles. He read it once. He read it again. He looked up at Haskell Braddock. Braddock said nothing. For the first time in the entire proceeding, Haskell Braddock had nothing to say. And then Leland Callaway stood up. Nobody expected it. Not DeSalle, not Braddock, not the judge. Leland rose from his chair the way a man rises when something inside him breaks. Not dramatically, not with violence, but with the sudden, graceless movement of a structure that has been holding itself together through sheer will and has finally reached the limit of what will can do. "This is absurd," he said. His voice was loud, too loud for a courtroom. The voice of a man who had lost control of the one thing he had always controlled, his composure. "That property has been in the Callaway family for 30 years. My father lived there. My brother lived there. I have documents, I have records, I have, Mr. Callaway," Judge Ferrers said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through Leland's the way a blade cuts through rope. "You are not a party to this proceeding in a speaking capacity. Sit down." Leland did not sit down. He stood there, his face red, his hands clenched at his sides, and he said the words that would end his case more decisively than any legal argument ever could. "Everyone in this county knows that property belongs to the Callaways. It has always belonged to the Callaways. My father made sure of that. The room heard it. DeSalle heard it. Ferrers heard it. And what they all heard beneath the anger and the bluster was the admission. My father made sure of that. Not my father inherited it, not my father purchased it, made sure of it. The language of arrangement. The language of a man who knew, who had always known, that the property had been taken, not given. and that the mechanism of that taking was exactly what DeSalle had described. Ferrers looked at Leland for a long moment. Then he looked at Braddock. Then he looked at the letter on his desk. He removed his spectacles, cleaned them with a cloth from his pocket, put them back on, and said, "This court will recess. The judgment will be rendered in due course." Due course, in the language of Judge Edmund Ferrers, meant 3 weeks. 3 weeks. 21 days of waiting, of not knowing, of living on the hill with the brown and the chickens, and the garden that was now producing the first small heads of lettuce, and the tomato plants that had begun to climb the stakes Colette had driven into the soil. 21 days of waking before dawn, and working until dark, and sitting at the oak table in the evenings with Marguerite's notebook open beside her, reading and rereading the pages as if they were a conversation that had not yet finished. She did not go to town during those 3 weeks. She did not need to. The baker came every morning. Whitford came twice a week ostensibly to check on her hands, which were healing well pink and tight across the palms. The new skin shiny and sensitive, but functional. Odette came once with an apple pie and a story about Marguerite that had nothing to do with law or property or injustice. A story about a summer afternoon when Marguerite had taught her how to make lavender soap, laughing at her own mistakes, getting the proportions wrong 3 times before getting them right. These stories mattered. They mattered because they were not evidence. They were not testimony. They were the small living details that made a dead woman real, that gave her dimension and warmth and the particular kind of humanity that courtrooms cannot capture, because courtrooms deal in facts, not in the smell of lavender soap on a summer afternoon. One evening, a few days before the judgment was due, Colette climbed to the roof of the collapsed East Tower. The floor of the tower was mostly gone, but the staircase still held stone steps, solid built into the wall, and from the top you could see the entire valley below. The rooftops of Carden red-brown in the late light, the church steeple leaning west, the fields stretching toward the river green now with the full growth of late spring. She stood there for a long time. She thought about Marguerite, who had stood perhaps in this same place, looking at this same view, knowing that no one was coming to help her. She thought about her mother, who had once told her that the life of a woman alone was a mountain that other people climbed on her back. She thought about Harlon, not with bitterness anymore, but with a kind of weary tenderness for a man who had not been strong enough to do the right thing, but who had at least tried to start, who had at least sat down and written the first sentences of a truth he could not finish. And she thought about the brown, the cow who had been thin and tired and unwanted, and who was now less thin and less tired, and who gave milk every morning, and who seemed to have accepted that a hilltop could be a decent place to live. There was something in that image, the cow, the grass, the stone house slowly taking shape under her hands, that felt right. Not romantic, not heroic, just right. The judgment arrived on a Thursday morning. DeSalle rode from St. Louis to bring it himself. He arrived at the gate of the stone house with an envelope in his coat pocket and a look on his face that told Colette nothing, because DeSalle was a man who had long ago learned that his face was part of his professional equipment, and that showing emotion before the appropriate moment was a form of carelessness. He handed her the envelope without speaking. Colette opened it. She read slowly. Her eyes moved across the lines of formal legal language. the language of courts and judges and the machinery of justice language that was designed to be precise, but that in this moment felt like something far larger, far older, far more human than any court had ever intended. She read it twice. Then she set the document on the oak table next to Marguerite's notebook, and she was quiet for a moment. She looked at the two objects side by side, the notebook, and the judgment, the voice of a dead woman, and the answer that had taken 21 years to arrive. They sat there on the same table where she had eaten her first meal in this house, where she had read the first line of Marguerite's journal, where she had spread out the deed and felt the weight of what it meant settle into her understanding. This table had held everything, and now it held this. "Well," DeSalle said softly, "the Succession Act of 1853 is annulled," Colette said. Her voice was steady. She did not cry. She was not a woman who cried at victories. She was a woman who nodded at them the way you nod at something you expected, but were not sure would come. The title of the stone house on Carden Hill is recognized as belonging to the direct line of Marguerite Delorme. In the absence of a living heir from that line and in consideration of the marriage of Harlon Calloway to Colette Morrow, the petitioner is recognized as the lawful inheritor. She looked up at him. "It's my house," she said. "It's your house," DeSalle said. "It always was." He did not smile. DeSalle was not a man who smiled at the conclusion of cases because he had learned that conclusions were rarely as clean as they appeared, and that the work of justice did not end when the judge signed the paper. But he allowed himself something a softening of the eyes, a slight release of the tension he had been carrying in his shoulders for weeks. It was the closest Raphael DeSalle came to celebration. Colette walked him to the gate. They stood there for a moment in the morning light, looking down the hill at the valley below. And DeSalle said something that she would remember for a long time. "Mrs. Calloway, in 30 years of practicing law, I have represented men who lost fortunes and men who gained them. I have seen verdicts that made the world better, and verdicts that made it worse. But I have never seen anyone fight harder for something with less to fight with. You came to this case with a burned stable, a cow, and a dead woman's notebook. And you won." "Marguerite won," Colette said. "Yes," DeSalle said. "I suppose she did." Leland Calloway appealed. He lost. The appellate court upheld Ferrer's judgment in full citing the original deed, the testimony of the witnesses and the letter from the Pratt archive as conclusive evidence of fraud in the 1853 succession. Leland's debts, which he had been managing through the collateral value of the Calloway name and the properties attached to it, now came due with no assets to cover them. The railroad speculation that had already taken his savings now took his credit. Within a year, he would sell the farm, Harlon's farm, the farm that should have been Colette's, to a buyer from Kansas City, who had no interest in Carden politics and no patience for Carden history. Leland moved to St. Louis. He was not heard from again. Haskell Braddock was summoned before the state notarial board and suspended from practice pending a disciplinary investigation. The investigation would take months, and during those months, every will, every deed, every document that Braddock had ever processed would be subject to review. His career, which had been built on the careful management of other people's secrets, was over. He closed his office on Main Street. The sign came down. The dark wood paneling and the oversized desk, and the clock that ticked with mechanical precision were sold at auction. Braddock moved to a smaller house on the edge of town and was seen less and less until eventually he was not seen at all. Prosper Calloway returned to St. Louis without saying goodbye to anyone. He had come to Cardin for a funeral and had stayed for a scandal, and he wanted no part of either one anymore. The farm. Harlon's farm, the 40 acres on the west side of town, did not return to Colette directly. It was not part of the judgment. DeSalle had told her plainly before the hearing, "You cannot win everything in a single battle." And Colette had accepted that because she understood something that Leland and Braddock and Prosper had never understood, that the stone house on Cardin Hill was not a consolation prize. It was not the thing you gave to someone when you wanted to give them nothing. It was the foundation. It was the ground from which everything else would grow. She did not try to fix everything at once. She chose the rooms that mattered, and she made them habitable one by one. She hired the carpenter Emmett Voss to rebuild the stable properly, this time with oak beams and a good roof. She planted the kitchen garden wider beans, squash potatoes, herbs. She bought 2 more chickens with the milk money, and then 2 more after that. Whitford came up the hill every week, not as a doctor. Colette was not sick. He came as something else, a friend perhaps, or simply as a man who needed to be near the thing that this place had become. The proof that some injustices could be undone if you held on long enough. Odette came too from time to time. She brought apple pie and stories about Marguerite. Not the heavy stories anymore, the legal ones, the sad ones. Lighter ones now. Small ones. Living ones. The kind of stories that made the dead a little less dead, and the past a little less past. Phineas Locke continued to teach at the schoolhouse. He never spoke publicly about what he had seen the envelope pass through the side door, but he did not need to. His testimony was on the court record, and the court record was public, and in a town the size of Cardin, public was permanent. And the Brown, who had survived the fire, who had survived the hill, who had survived being given to a woman that nobody expected to last a month. The Brown continued to give milk every morning, standing patiently in the new stable, while Colette worked her breath warm in the cool air, her eyes calm and uncomplaining. On an evening in June, with the sun dropping slowly behind the western hills and the light turning everything, the color of warm honey, Colette took the silver locket from the trunk in the cellar. She had kept it close since the beginning, not worn, not displayed, but kept. In her pocket during the day, on the table beside her bed at night, a small weight, a small reminder, a small connection to the woman whose fight she had finished. She walked into the garden, not the kitchen garden, the other one, the old garden. The wild garden that had been swallowed by 21 years of neglect and was now slowly being reclaimed. In a far corner beneath an oak tree whose branches spread wide enough to shade the ground beneath, there was a flat stone set into the earth. The stone was small, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. Grass had grown over its edges. Moss had filled the shallow letters carved into its surface, but the letters were still there if you knelt down and brushed the moss away with your fingers. Marguerite Calloway, née Delorme, 1815 to 1861. No one had visited this stone in 21 years. No one had knelt here. No one had spoken her name in this place or laid flowers or mourned. Colette knelt down. She placed the silver locket on the stone. She did not pray. She did not speak. She stayed there in silence, her hands resting on her knees, her eyes on the name carved into the rock, and she felt something that was not grief, and not pity, and not triumph. It was recognition. The recognition of one woman for another across a distance of 21 years, and a silence that had almost won. The recognition that Marguerite had written the truth and hidden it, and trusted that someone would come. And someone had come. Not a lawyer, not a judge, not a powerful man with connections and money. A woman with a suitcase and a cow and burned hands and the refusal to be erased. Colette stayed there for a long time. The light changed around her. The shadows of the oak tree lengthened across the grass. A mockingbird sang from somewhere in the branches above, running through its catalog of borrowed songs, each one different, each one someone else's melody made new. Then she stood up. She brushed the dirt from her knees. She looked at the locket one last time, the silver catching the last of the light, the small oval face of a man in uniform looking up at the sky from beneath the glass. She turned and walked back toward the house. The brown was waiting in the pen, her head raised, watching Colette approach with the patient, unsurprised expression of an animal that has learned to expect certain things at certain times and finds comfort in the repetition. The chickens clucked softly in their coop. Through one of the repaired windows, the warm glow of the cast-iron stove spilled into the evening air. Colette stopped at the threshold. She put her hand on the doorframe. The stone was cool under her fingers. It was the same stone that Marguerite's father had chosen, that Marguerite had touched, that had held this house together through decades of silence and neglect, and the slow, corrosive work of men who believed that taking something was the same as owning it. Her door, her stone, her house. Colette stepped inside. Behind her on the flat stone beneath the oak tree, the silver locket caught the last thread of light and held it the way truth holds the things it is given quietly, patiently, for as long as it takes. Marguerite had written on the first page of her notebook, "I begin this journal because if I do not write it down, no one will ever know the truth." She had been right about one thing. It had taken 21 years for someone to find it, but she had been wrong about the rest. Because the truth, even buried behind a stone in a fireplace, even wrapped in faded velvet. And silence does not disappear. It waits. It waits for someone to have the courage to look for it. And when that person comes, even exhausted, even grieving, even with nothing but a suitcase and a skinny cow, the truth does what it has always known how to do. It rises.